Welcome to Policy and Governance Perspectives, the official podcast of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Join Dr. David Ramadan and Schar School experts as they engage in thought-provoking conversations with elected officials, policymakers, and thought leaders. Listen for in-depth discussions on policies, politics, governance, and career pathways, all designed to elevate your perspectives and expand your mind.
I'm Dr. David Ramadan, and this is Policy and Governance Perspectives, the official podcast of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Today's conversation sits at the intersection of government, power, civil discourse, and one of the most foundational principles in any democracy, free speech. We'll explore recent efforts to regulate dissenting speech, the legal and constitutional implications, and what this all means for higher education institutions like ours. I'm pleased to be joined by my co-host for this episode, the Honorable Barbara Comstock, former Congresswoman from Virginia's 10th District and founder of the Barbara Comstock Program for Women in Leadership at the Schar School. Barbara has been a dear friend for decades and was my colleague at the Virginia House of Delegates. And we're honored to welcome our guest, Walter Olson, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and one of the nation's leading voices on constitutional law, civil liberties, and free expression. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
All right, Walter, let's start with you. What are the most constitutionally troubling elements of the executive order on domestic extremism and speech that President Trump issued a few days ago? And you may please tell us a little bit about that order as well.
Okay. Well, this was an order issued not too long after the public outcry and upset at the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, where feelings were running high. And it's an executive order that promises a crackdown, a somewhat ill-defined crackdown, on what it claims are types of extremism and types of political speech and action that allegedly cause a climate of violence, which then cause individual violent people to act on their impulses. And these sorts of claims, which is that the government needs to address itself to cracking down on speech because speech leads to violence, are of course not new. Almost anyone who's been around has heard this from various sides at various times. But this was actually a kind of set of marching orders, albeit vague, as I mentioned, which suggests that the government will investigate and disrupt actions that they believe encourage radicalization, encourage people to rationalize violence or sympathize with violence, and tagging along are interesting smaller portions with a lot of potential, namely that the government may seek to go after nonprofits that it believes have contributed to ideas of radicalization or to street demonstrations that turn violent or whatever, and that, of course, rings bells in the with those of us who follow free speech issues generally. But you asked about the First Amendment implications, and usually when something like this issued by the government, they are very careful to run it by lawyers to distinguish speech protected by the First Amendment and to swear up and down that they do not intend to disrupt or harass people engaged in that speech, and then draw a clear distinction with the types of speech, and we'll discuss those, I'm sure, in a minute, that are not protected by the First Amendment, and where the courts recognize that it's okay for the government to punish and to regulate and to discourage in other ways. This executive order didn't do that. This executive order kind of slopped things together as in certain types of restaurant meals where they don't care if the French fries touch the baked beans. And that leaves, with many readers, including me, very much the impression that they are intending to use government force against some categories of advocacy that are protected by the First Amendment. If I can rattle on just a bit longer, what does the First Amendment say? It says we have that Congress shall not infringe on the freedom of speech. It also has two other clauses. The right of the people peaceably to assemble must not be infringed, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, numbers 2 and 3 here we don't mention as often as free speech, but they clearly are a gesture toward assembly, what we think of today as demonstrations in many cases, and petition for redress of grievances, which specifically focuses on agitation, as it were, which might not take the form of assemblies, but agitation to get the government to change policy. Now, this executive order, interestingly, tracks it. It complains of radicalization whose object can be to change government policy. Well, right there you have radicalization in and of itself is usually taken to be protected speech. It may be objectionable, offensive speech, trying to push people into radical positions. But from a different perspective, that's just what the First Amendment is all about. Is the most protected stuff of all is speech intended to get people to change their political positions. And then it goes on to say that it's particularly going to take a look at ones that are intended to affect democracy and its outcomes or government policy. And again, in specifying that, they are kind of specifying that they will be looking specifically at going after the kinds of speech that the framers of the First Amendment would have thought as absolutely core, more than artistic speech, more than entertainment speech. It is that political speech of agitation against what is seen as bad government that is at the very core of the First Amendment.
So everybody knows that yelling fire in a theater is not necessarily protected, but here we're testing something different, right? Under the use of "quote unquote" radicalization, disruption, there's a new part of the law here, or an old part of the law, which is the second and third part of the First Amendment, is what's going to be tested. Am I correct with that?
They are going to test the limits of things that the courts have seen as protected and how that will play out as far as whether the courts respond vigorously or whether we see victories in practice that may not reflect actual victories in a court ruling. And we've seen that in the cowing and discouragement of speech sometimes by places that don't want to go through legal process. They don't want to face a possible Justice Department investigation, much less prosecution, regulatory consequences, tax consequences, as I mentioned earlier. All of these things could chill speech, whether or not we ever wind up getting a court ruling out of it. So it's going to be aimed at some of those things. We have some clues as to some of the rationales and some of the areas they're going to be pushing on. Those who have taken their First Amendment course at George Mason or other places will remember the kind of list of exceptions, list of things that are okay for the government to regulate or suppress. And that can include obscenity, it can include fraudulent speech, it can include speech that infringes on someone's copyright. But for these purposes of political advocacy, the ones that come up often are incitement and threatening speech. Sometimes stalking might be also, and it's important that we come back and take a look at those because the law is actually pretty well settled on a lot of that. And the law doesn't seem to be in the place that the Trump administration thinks it is. It's the law narrowly cabins the concept of incitement and not just threat, but quote unquote true threat, with this special legal term, in order to prevent the government from suppressing a lot of things that are dangerous, perhaps, that someone should know better than doing, but don't fall into those incitement or threat categories. And that is something, almost immediately when I discuss these issues, the issues raised by the executive order, although, as I said, very few of them are new, people say, well, isn't that incitement? So
Before I turn over the microphone to Barbara, just a quick follow-up on that. We're recording this on October 1. Our listeners will probably hear this episode in about 14 days or so. By then, I assume there would be few lawsuits filed on this executive order. That are we hearing of who is doing what on that matter?
Not necessarily, because with lawsuits, especially these days, you've got to wait for standing. You've got to wait for someone's rights to be trampled on. And that may not happen in coming weeks.
Got it. Barbara, the microphone is yours. Co-host, the Honorable Barbara Comstock.
Well, in your piece, Walter, you rightfully identified a concern the way there might be a going after the tax exemption of charities and foundations that may have given, there's talk of any groups that may have given dollars to organizations or groups that might be, if there's a person that is associated with a group that might have done something, that then they'll go after the groups. And then when you look at some of the Project 2025 goals where they wanted to go after particular 501c3 groups, and they had an earlier executive order this year back in February where they wanted to have some of the agencies bring lawsuits against some of these foundations and charities. And these are, a lot of, there's liberal and conservative charities, who are out there giving money to organizations. And to use a conservative example, say if there was a conservative organization that gave money to a pro-life group, and a member of that pro-life group happened to go out and blow up an abortion clinic, as someone who's pro-life, I wouldn't want to see a pro-life group have their tax status taken away or have any of their individual rights taken away, or necessarily, have them investigated. You go and you investigate the person who blew up the abortion clinic. And certainly in the last administration, we had people very concerned about were people in Catholic churches being investigated wrongfully if they protested about certain policies. So really to get this into, the concerns of, listen, this is something that can impact both sides. And so when you talked about the charities and the foundations that may get targeted here, do you think people really appreciate how that is going to impact, if that kind of action is taken, that can be led. There are people on the left and the right who are hostile to many of these good groups that do a lot of things that people on each side have an interest in changing policy and doing good works and helping people change, whether it's, if they care about clean water and clean air, or they care about helping women with their pregnancies, or whatever the issue is that might have disagreement on maybe a national policy level. These are people at the local level who are helping people. And do we, in these attacks, want to disrupt what many of these good groups are doing, even if you don't agree with their agenda necessarily? People have given their money to these groups. It's been distributed to these groups. And even if there's a bad apple or two in them, go after them on the criminal level if they do something bad, but don't start attacking these groups themselves. And I think you identified that concern, and just wanted you to maybe talk about that and put that in perspective, since you've seen the history of that from both sides. And I know Cato has been one of the rare groups that's consistent and criticizing this on both sides when sometimes action is taken to go after one side or the other.
Everything you say, Barbara, I agree with. And it's very, very important that we think carefully before we throw away what has been kind of a long-standing informal peace treaty on things like trying to go after the tax exemptions of ideologically opposed groups. It's not as if there hasn't been murmuring at various points from many directions about, hey, let's go after their tax exemptions. But people realized first that the society needs an independent sector. It needs a sector that is not under the thumb of directors from Washington about what you can say and what you can't say. And it benefits when that is a diverse sector. I was so heartened to see Lawson Bader, who is the head of Donors Trust, one of the leading conservative philanthropy guys in the country, who had a wonderful statement yesterday saying it's time for conservative philanthropy people to speak out, because if the Open Society Foundation, which is Soros's, or if the Ford Foundation can be targeted without really any good evidence that they've broken the law, and I agree with his analysis there isn't any good evidence, then everyone is vulnerable when the wheel turns. And I say often, protect your opponent's rights, because when the wheel turns, you're going to find out that you protected your own rights when you did that. And so thank you, Lawson Bader, for saying that. He says that it's time to calm down. There's a couple of reasons also in practice why the attack on nonprofits exemptions is a dangerous one. One of them is that for many types of legal attack, there's a gradation in which there are little small fines, and then, the more serious the offense, determined by some court, the more serious the fines. Well, in the world of nonprofits, you have this death switch of, revoke the whole tax exemption because of perhaps misconduct or bad results in one of the 1,000 things they supported as a huge foundation. And that, call it a nuclear penalty or whatever, that gets people into apocalyptic thinking of, oh my God, we support 1,000 things at this foundation. They're going to try to cut us all off rather than have some sort of regulatory sanction about go and sin no more on this mistake you made with a group that you should have vetted better before giving them money. And again, this is across the board. It is any sorts of foundations can get caught up on this. Universities in their own way also distribute money to a lot of things and sometimes get in trouble in some of those same ways. And so, as Lawson Bader says, step back, calm down, realize that we are legislating not just for our opponents, but for ourselves too. And beyond that, we don't want to, and we've already risked, a lot of people remember in the Obama administration, the scandal, and I think it was a scandal, about investigations of conservative groups, which were being done in highly burdensome ways that caused little grassroots groups that just wanted to get together as Constitution study group to suddenly be hit with 100-page document demands and so forth. It's so easy to abuse. It's such a treasure to have reached a point where there was a bipartisan consensus against that kind of abuse. And it's so hard to police that abuse. Let's not open the door for it to come back.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I
actually, if
totally
I didn't
agree.
mention, I just wanted to clarify, the earlier executive order was on DEI, and it seems like these same groups that have been targeted on DEI policies that aren't necessarily illegal, just the administration happens to not like them, and you may not like that policy, but a next administration could say some groups have a policy on being some of the anti-woke or whatever policies they might have, that if a new administration says, well, I don't like when private sector groups have such and such a policy, and we're going to go after a private sector group because of a policy we don't like. And these same groups that they've been saying they want to go after on DEI, it's now been switched over to this First Amendment violence. So it seems like it's been switched to, well, first it was that issue. Now we're going to, switch the tables. But as you rightly pointed out, this is something that we had gained as kind of a bipartisan consensus, like, let's not start opening the door to go after the private sector communities because, and I hadn't seen the donors trust comment, that is important that they come together like that because it is, there's just great work being done by these groups on both sides of the aisle. And it's advocacy, that First Amendment issue that we all care about, and having the right to have people contribute to that. And I know from being active on, getting Supreme Court justices confirmed, there is a lot of donor money that went into 501c3 groups that were involved in that activity. And I could see a future liberal organization very much wanting to, a future liberal administration very much wanting to target groups like that.
I want to talk a little bit about universities and DI free speech there, but before we go there, let me just clarify. The words doxing and the words justifying violence are not necessarily defined legally, not on a federal level for sure. Am I correct, Walter?
That is correct.
All right. So, Barbara, from your experience, both at the State House and at the Federal House of Representatives, what is the legislative role here that needs to be taken, especially after we're seeing this come up to the surface again? As you both mentioned, this is not just a Republican issue. There was abuse during the Obama administration. Now there's abuse during the Trump administration. So where's the legislative role? Is this a state or a federal issue to be fixed, and how?
Well, I think what would be more helpful instead of this is having some congressional oversight on some of this. So we hear, whatever issues there might be on this, have some oversight and try to bring some bipartisan consensus here, and realize certainly in the area of violence, which this all came out of, the gun violence and just a horrible incident. And there've been more than this also happened in the context of a Catholic church being shot up, as well as the horrible murder of Charlie Kirk. So we have a lot of violence out there for a lot of reasons, but however, and people, when these things happen, unfortunately, people go to their corners and want to blame the other side when we know that this is unfortunately, since my daughter has just moved back from Australia where they don't see these things every day. Her children had 3 years of not having to deal with this. So you would think this would be a good opportunity for some oversight to come up with some, why are we seeing this? How can we work together on this? Let's find some bipartisan consensus. And I think you may have been there, David, or maybe it was a little before your time when we had some of these incidents in Virginia where we did come together, some difficult issues, and find what are some bills that we can pass in this area that are bipartisan. And one of my great frustrations when I was in Congress is it was rare. I mean, I did have some legislation that I actually did with Senator Cornyn that we did do on this that was bipartisan. Wasn't much, but it actually was signed by Donald Trump of all people. But it was on getting the NICS list updated a bit and trying to track down some of these bad guys who shouldn't have guns in the first place. But there needs to be a lot more oversight, I think, in this area, and not a rush to go after groups or, these conclusions that kind of are implicit in a lot of these executive orders have come before real factual, fact-finding missions that should be done by congressional oversight.
Thank you. Walter?
Yeah, if I could pursue that a little more, because I think there's a really useful point where legislators can get involved. David raised two areas, so-called speech justifying violence, and that one I'm just going to toss to the side because there is no proper government role in regulating speech justifying violence. It has to be some other grounds than the fact that someone saw violence as justified. But the second one, doxing, is interesting. It is not well defined, and what we call doxing informally consists of a combination of some speech that is likely protected by the First Amendment with some other speech that is not. Let me give examples. We all remember after the Dobbs decision when people picketed close to the private homes of Supreme Court justices, and it was worried, and with some good grounds, that the Supreme Court justices could be made personally unsafe as a result of this. Not going to get into all the details, but the Supreme Court, of course, ironically or otherwise, is the very body that shapes the rules about consistent with the First Amendment, can you prohibit the publication of someone's home address or the assembly for purposes of petition within, a block, half a block, right in front of their front door? What is permitted assembly? What is permitted petitioning? And the court, I think, pursuing principle rather than some sort of self-interest, never wavered and never gave the impression that it was going to be okay if Congress banned the publication of the addresses of Supreme Court justices' home residences because they care more about the principle, even if they are themselves being put at risk by it. One of the things, there's a lot that I admire actually about the federal court system. One of the institutions that has not failed us in the way that a number of other institutions have. But so you get, therefore, this question around doxing, which is if it's legally protected to print someone's address, and if that's true of a Supreme Court justice, I would say it is. But it is necessarily true of law enforcement. Also, it is true of an ICE agent, for example. But where doxing probably does get into a punishable and unprotected zone is when it's combined with something else, such as encouragement of harassment, such as activities that we would recognize as stalking, some of which are not protected by the First Amendment. So you've got that term doxing, which bridges some things that are pretty clearly protected with some things that pretty clearly aren't. I find myself wishing constantly that we had people in power who draw fine distinctions and say we intend to go after the unprotected kind and not the protected kind. So have no worries that we will suppress your speech unless you are organizing harassment or something like that. We don't. That's not the administration that we have, but we should be prepared as they turn this into prosecutions to keep those things in mind ourselves. It's an unpopular position for me to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is, ICE agents and police in general, with a few possible very unusual exceptions having to do with undercover projects lasting a while, they do have to expect that they will be under the same magnifying glass that Supreme Court justices and state legislators. I mean, we all know that state legislators have gotten lots of death threats and acts of actual violence, sometimes connected with where they live personally, as in Minnesota. We have all collectively, and I think correctly, decided that much as our admiration goes out to the state legislators who run these risks, and to the many, many judges who get the death threats, that we don't want to sacrifice the First Amendment, even in this kind of emergency. So,
as a matter of fact, for state legislators, sorry to interrupt, Walter, for state legislators or for any legislator, the first thing we do when you're a candidate for office is to go file in a piece of paper that declares where you live. So we publish our own.
They have to look it up to make sure that you live in your district. So that is something. And so I think I had people come and protest at my home, and things sometimes.
So we publish our own addresses.
Many people I know that have had demonstrations in front of their homes, and with ugly language, with terrible language being addressed at them over loudspeakers. And sometimes it's possible, what lawyers call time, place, and manner regulation. The bullhorns at 12 p.m. or at midnight, no. But part of what comes with the territory in public life is putting up with a lot of things. And, I do see the point of the ICE agents and the police. I don't see their point in masking, but I do see their point in thinking that there should be a great deal of social stigma of publishing their addresses in many cases. Nonetheless, I also want some consideration for, let's say, the election administrators. They've gotten thousands of death threats. These are often volunteers, low-paid county employees or city employees, and they run a gauntlet of death threats just because some people think the election was stolen and harass them as a result. So we all need to, step back and not identify just with one camp, but try to also identify with people who are genuinely being made afraid.
And that is, I can tell you, because I'm the president of the Former Members Association, as well as the worked with the National Council on Election Integrity. And one of the things we've seen is this increased violence and threats. And it comes from both extremes, thinking that violence is more acceptable. And each side does make excuses for the other side, for their own side. And, example of, the individual, the officer on January 6th who shot, the person coming into the Capitol who was breaking the window and about to go right onto the floor of the Capitol. And whenever I show people where Ashley Babbitt was, and as she was about to go in, she had been warned, they'd been warned to stop. And then, there was a whole investigation of that. He was exonerated, yet his life was put in danger by the many threats against him for that. People often forget that there were people who were part of that whole January 6th group that got trampled by their own people. Nobody ever got as upset about the poor people who got trampled. Of course, 140 police officers who also got attacked. Again, one side ignores that group. And then they also want to ignore, as you mentioned, the Minnesota folks who get attacked. So this is a fact of life that has been increasingly more dangerous. But again, that's why we need that oversight in Congress. So it's not just while this executive order came out of one incident that the administration was concerned about, these incidents have been rising, and the Capitol itself has been warning that they are overwhelmed by the threats to the members of Congress and the climate that has been really dangerous since January 6th.
And thank you for bringing that back, because it gets to the point that I wanted to tie together, which is that when you've got a close case situation like doxing plus possible harassment, it can help a lot for legislators to try to get in and draw reasonable lines. And I think of instances like abortion clinic buffer zones and things in which the courts have often deferred, saying, okay, well, the legislature tried to balance these rights. It is a close case with rights on both sides. they heard lots of testimony and were going to defer to what the legislator thought was the right way of balancing the rights in that instance. And I think that doxing, when combined with worse things, is another area where if lawmakers tried to draft a reasonable set of rules to get into the gray areas and decide which is on which side, courts might welcome that. I can tell you that if legislators have not done that, then the way that a lot of judges will approach the thing is to say, there is no enacted law against this behavior, and so you must not punish the person for doing it. That's the way that the analysis goes if you haven't banned the thing by law. So, lawmakers have a unique role in being able to speak for the public on these very close cases.
And Walter, are you talking about both federal and state level?
You could do either. My inclination is to start at the state level just because that's where criminal law originates. And then if there is felt to be some sort of national crisis of the area going wrong, then maybe look at the federal level. But I'd start at the state with state legislatures.
So to summarize this section, we all agree that there's no room for violence. Everybody's against violence, that there shouldn't be just a blanket protection for everybody in law enforcement or everybody, because if it's okay for Supreme Court justices and for legislators' addresses to be published, then we should operate, whether it's government or law enforcement, in the open, not in secret. However, there should be reasonable exemptions and rules when needed, and that could be on state level. Did I summarize this correctly?
It sounds good to me.
Thank you. All right. Dear and near to my hearts are universities. And if we're talking about free speech, we cannot talk about free speech without talking about universities. That's where free speech starts. That's where we teach kids to do so. I am an immigrant who arrived here with a heavy accent, at age of 19, and $2,000 in my pocket and a dream. And George Mason University had created a conservative that went on to serve as the first adult immigrant in Mr. Jefferson's house in history. So free speech to me is important. The role of universities is important. I penned an op-ed in USA Today in late September that argued that eliminating DEI programs in public universities is the wrong approach. And instead of attacking these institutions, conservatives should engage with them. Let's strengthen universities by widening and promoting viewpoint diversity, including conservatives. Let's get conservative representation, which we all agree. There's not enough conservatives in higher ed. I'm one of few. Barbara is one of few. So there needs to be more conservative representations in faculty, in leadership, in curriculum, and therefore we should reform or change DEI, but not to retreat it. I don't want to talk about DEI per se, but I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on what are the legal, for you, Walter, what are the legal risks for universities restricting speech too broadly, and the lack of conservatism in universities, which is a fact.
A bunch of big questions there, and I will start with the risks for universities. And one of the points I make when I start out on these higher ed issues is how diverse higher education is. You've got state institutions and you've got private institutions, and the constitutional and legal rules are completely different between the two. And then you've got religious colleges, a very important sector. And one of the things about religious colleges, and I have to say this is completely trampled by some of the proposals that I see for having the federal government impose some sort of Aussie First Amendment standard on every higher education institution, is that the religious ones are often organized specifically in order to hold some values true and other ones false. And they are offering an experience, an important part of which consists of validating some views rather than others. Not all religious colleges, obviously, but some important ones, yes. And so with that, I step back from the idea that one answer is necessarily going to fit each of those three categories. And start with public universities, because that's where we are right now. They come under a bunch of additional constitutional requirements that do not apply to the Harvards or the Stanfords of the world. And that involves certain expectations of political neutrality. They need to call it a higher standard if you want, but the fact is that when they fire a professor or expel a student for ideological reasons, it's possible they violated the Constitution, which is not true when Yale or Princeton does so, by and large. So we look at that. One of the things, and I agree in not wanting to get into a big DEI sideline, but as someone who has been over my career very critical of a lot of the practices that got identified with DEI, the standards on hiring and student admission and so forth, I see this bulldozer being brought in, knocking over not only many of the things that I objected to, but also Washington these days seems to take this view that even being in favor of DEI in spirit is a violation of the law, even if they can't trace that to anyone's being treated badly. The old idea was that the government was going to mind how you actually treated the professors if you weren't denying someone tenure for an improper reason. If you weren't denying someone admission as a student for an improper reason, then the fact that you had some sort of woozy atmosphere that differed from the government's policy on this wouldn't get anyone into court, because these woozy atmospheres of, gee, we like the ideals and so forth, is another of the things that the First Amendment is there to protect. Even in public universities, there's a role for the First Amendment in protecting people's right to endorse as ideas things that may not currently be part of the law, things that may have been rejected by the Supreme Court. It's still okay to get up on a podium and say, I wish the Supreme Court hadn't ruled that way in the Harvard admission case. I wish we could go back to, and maybe overturn that decision. That's very often First Amendment protected speech. And yet the education authorities and Department of Justice in Washington just often are acting as if you can't even talk the talk, regardless of whether you take any action.
Barbara, from your leadership program on promoting open discourse, give me some reflections on your thoughts on this, especially as it comes. You've helped young women, train them on our system and open and free speech. Where are you on this?
Yeah, well, I think regardless of how you feel about DEI, it's not illegal to have programs that help particular groups. It's been going on forever. And there was an example at University of Virginia where, let's give you the details here, is the Commerce Cohort program, which provided mentorship to first-year students based on need, not race. Yet the current Justice Department is claiming the program was discriminatory because most of the participants who signed up were non-white. So even though the program's criteria were race neutral and the UVA's freshman class happened to be majority non-white, they were going to claim that this was some kind of DEI program. So this absurd logic, that outcomes, now it's outcomes. So they don't even say it wasn't even a racial program. So I know with my program, we would reach out to all kinds of people because we knew the type of I founded my program because I knew when I was a young student, like in high school, because it's for high school girls, junior high, I was often working in the summer to save up money for college. And my parents were a teacher and a salesperson, and I didn't see a lot of those kind of opportunities, someone coming to me. So we try and reach out to people who aren't the automatic kids who hear about these type of programs. So we don't have a formal way of reaching out, but we would reach out to make sure we were getting a diverse group of girls who were coming. Actually, it's open. We've had some boys who got into it too, but to a diverse group of students and young women, because we wanted to make sure kids who didn't have those opportunities, who didn't know about those type of opportunities, that they would have that opportunity to hear from women leaders in our community. So that was the purpose of it, is to just spread that type of opportunity to a more economically diverse group, a more, people who just didn't have that type of exposure, because the whole concept was just to see people in their place of work and see them leading and have them tell you how they lead, and then get to ask them questions when you're a freshman and a sophomore in high school. What is it like to head up the legal department at Northrop Grumman, or head up whatever department in a hospital or in a tech company? And how did you, right? They met with Sheila Johnson, and she told them how she had faced discrimination as a young girl, how her father, who was a doctor, couldn't work in all the hospitals that she was able to, that others were able to work in. So this was just a great program like that. I never thought of it as a DEI program, but today when I listen to some people who attack programs, I think, well, gee, I realized I hadn't had that type of exposure, and I had a pretty, normal middle class upbringing. I just wanted to have as many people and as many diverse people, and our community is incredibly diverse, to be able to come in and have that same type of exposure that, say, maybe a prep school kid whose dad knows everybody. They meet those kind of people, the cocktail parties that their parents have, but I hadn't met those kind of people growing up, and I want them now to actually walk into these companies and
I
see it
remember
in
on
real life and
several
imagine
occasions,
being that person when they grow up.
and I remember on several occasions, Barbara, when you and I were on the campaign trails walking around, people would stop you and say, "My daughter went to your program, and they are, our average constituents who never didn't know you, didn't know me in person, didn't have the quote unquote the connections, but their daughters were in that program, and they truly felt the value of that program."
And
I
I've been
can
excited.
talk.
I meet them as chiefs of staff for other, I think we were down at the House of Delegates together, and somebody came up after we were talking to a group of delegates, and they said, "Hi, I was in your program. I'm now the chief of staff to
That is
Senator
great. That
whoever it
is great.
was." And
That
that's
is
pretty
great.
exciting.
We're getting towards the end of this episode, and I would love to spend another hour talking about these issues with both of you, and perhaps we can schedule another episode in a few months. And keep in mind this thought. I got an email yesterday from a dean. I'll keep the person unnamed, of a big school in a big Virginia university, and said, "Loved your piece in the USA Today. Tell me, how are we differentiating between a conservative person and conservative ideology? And what's legal for me now if I want to hire a conservative to ask? Or what are the questions?" And, that'll be probably a whole episode that we can spend on that. So keep that as food for thought for now. And let me close with what
And
comes
I
next.
think the donors trust, and that the conservative donors trust is seeing this too. I think probably maybe bringing together some of those folks. That's exciting. I think we've seen that sort of with some of the action the FCC took, that you got more people, not just some of those who were being attacked, but you had people saying, "Hey, I don't even like this guy," but it's freedom of speech. So I think the fact that folks like the Donors Trust are stepping up, I think maybe we're getting back to that, or at the beginning, a glimmer of this needs to be bipartisan. And I really want to credit Walter and Cato for having been there when it was on the other side of the aisle, and consistently been one of those to identify it, and somebody who has that long history and can remind us we've been here before and we need to get back to that bipartisan history.
Indeed. So, Walter, final words are for you, sir, to close this episode with your thoughts, including what gives us hope today for the resilience of our First Amendment.
The First Amendment has been a pretty amazing thing. It is stronger in what it protects in the United States than elsewhere. It has emerged, like so many of our legal rights, it's emerged from a history of abuse in which the presidents and others did bad things, and then people united in defense of, Eugene V. Debs, languishing in jail because he was an anti-war socialist. And this built an inheritance of rights that I don't think Americans want to throw away. We are slow to anger. We are slow to counter-mobilize. And yet I think that public opinion is out there and is gradually mobilizing on the right side of this. And I don't think public opinion can be ignored.
Thank you. I've been saying for a while now, again, drawing on my immigration experience and story and the fortunes of my family on this greatest shining city on the hill, that every day is a great day in this great nation, even the bad days. And we have had a lot of bad days, but every day is a great day in this great nation. God bless this nation.
And
Thank
making
you.
sure we all still use our public voices, and that they not be silenced, and that people, whether it's at universities or at our think tanks, which are obviously some of those groups that might get targeted too in the day, and we want to see those voices be vibrant and fearless in speaking up for those rights our founders gave us.
Thank you. This was a fascinating discussion with our guest for today, Walter Olson, Senior Fellow of the Cato Institute and one of the nation's leading voices on constitutional law, civil liberties, and free expression. The Honorable Barbara Comstock, my dear friend, former member of the House of Delegates, former Congresswoman from Virginia. Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you on another episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of another insightful episode of Policy and Governance Perspectives. We truly appreciate you joining us for these important discussions featuring voices from across the Schar School. For more information and to explore our archive of past episodes, please visit schar.gmu.edu/podcast. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to sharing more with you next time.